Good morning, everyone. I'm Dindo Manhit, the President and CEO of the Strat-based Albert Del Rosario Institute and one of the conveners of Democracy Watch, a project within the Strat-based group that we have supported since 2013, so nearly 9 years ago. This morning, I'd like to welcome you specifically to our virtual town hall discussion, a government agenda for development in the Marcos Jr. presidency post-pandemic. And allow me to welcome you with slides, data that we continue to track with regards to governance. It's been our tradition since 2004 in Strat-based Group to track issues from the point of view of the Filipino people. And this is what we see across geographic area, across demographic areas, how the economic consequences of a post-pandemic, of a post-2022 election seem to be on the top of mind of the Filipino people. Even on their most urgent personal concern, it means what is in their heart, what is important to their day-to-day life. Gut issues about staying healthy, securing a well-paying job or source of income, about putting food on their table. When you hear and see this, it remains consistent to what we have tracked during the election campaign. As we have tracked the performance of then outgoing administration, perceived to be popular, true, but actually when you specifically focus on key issues, this is the legacy that they left for the new administration of President Marcos Jr. How they have improved a little in areas of inflation, poverty, jobs, pay of workers. But at the height of the campaign, this was a big challenge to the public. Graft and corruption, which continues to be number 5. They improved it, and I always joke the people in our team that maybe that's why there was a massive spending on a Duterte legacy propaganda campaign. But still, at the core of this reflects that the public consider this as not a total failure, but maybe they know the previous administration have not done well. And it's also reflective on some data that we track. Though COVID is perceived to be worse, has been in our past, it's behind us at 83%. It's really the economic consequences, the continuous poverty of people. When 77% of Filipinos identify themselves as poor, when they define themselves as hungry, recovering from the height of the 2020-2021 pandemic years, but still, given all the government projects. And at the core of this is the reality that when there are no jobs, there are no income. Though it has stabilized in terms of unemployment, I always look at the underemployed. When you have 6.67 million Filipinos underemployed. That's why income, wages is always a concern for Filipinos. There's that uncertainty of where their next meal will come from if there's uncertainty on their wages. But the reality, the legacy of the Duterte government, the new administration, is really limited the fiscal space. We have read this in the news, and I'm quoting government data. It leaves us with this challenge of how do you deal with fiscal deficit. Will we tax our people more? I hope not. Not at this time that people are suffering. Not at this time that it will create burden with our people. So this kind of a reality is what I believe was the policy environment when President Marcos Jr. delivered his State of the Nation address. So a big percentage of his the early part of his SONA really focused on the economy. There's enough legal framework to really move from a consumption-based economy to an investment-led growth. But it needs sound fiscal management, according to President Marcos Jr., to attract local and foreign investment, to generate partnership and build. Tax administration should be focused, not new taxes. And I remember the first applause of there will be no longer be lockdowns. Or issues on investing on energy. Or generating productivity in the agricultural sector. Or helping our farmers make their lives more productive through a one-year moratorium on amortizations and interest payments of land reform beneficiaries. Modernize the capacity of farmers with new technologies. Of course, we look forward to face-to-face classes. But I always tell people, let's not make it compulsory to all, because face-to-face classes was never the policy of from a point of view of modern distance learning education. So there should be options. Towards the latter part, we heard of countries' independent foreign policy, standing firm with it. But I always take note of national interest. And there's no other national interest except to listen to the opinion of the Filipino people that would like us to assert our rights, build on our capacity by modernizing our Coast Guard and our Navy. So again, this is a speech which we will discuss in the next 2 hours. How do we execute this? Post-SONA, we saw the cabinet identifying an 8-point socioeconomic agenda the day after. Still, nothing definite, but it's a good first step. That's why I always, in my mind, I say, now I wait for the budget for 2023, or the reallocation of the budget, to see where the priorities of government are. If these are the priorities, then we will see funding for this 8-point agenda. Then we see these 19 legislative priorities. With Congress, with a supermajority, we have a habit of calling it now supermajority, but it always happens after an election. 19 priority legislation. Do we see the leadership in the Senate? Through Senate President Subiri, the speakership of Speaker Romualdez. Push substantive legislation based on this legislative priorities identified by the president. A lot of things needs to be done. From a speech, from 3 weeks of this administration. That's why the day after the post-SONA discussion of the cabinet, 2 days after the SONA, I wrote about it in my regular Business World commentary. However, this plan of action still need to be explained. So this could address Filipinos' most urgent concerns. And we need to feel this execution in the next few months. Again, good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I pass on to our friend, our moderator, Attorney Tony Abad, professor from the Ateneo College of Law.
Thank you, Boss Dindo. and thank you for having me again. I'm always honored and happy to be of service to the Strat-based ADR Institute. Um, hold on. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. highlighted his administration's priorities during his recent State of the Nation address. This SONA was very comprehensive, you notice, covered everything from the economy to education, infrastructure, energy, agriculture, OFWs, health, technology, and the environment. And given the length and breadth of this SONA, there's a need to make sense of the points that were raised and discussed, and to evaluate and refine the administration's agenda, and to suggest actionable recommendations to help this new administration lead the country in a post-pandemic era. Welcome to this virtual town hall discussion, which is organized by Strat-based ADR Institute and Democracy Watch Philippines. It will bring together different thought leaders in the country to discuss what is needed for a post-pandemic government agenda for development. We hope that this discussion will serve as an avenue to exchange ideas, really dive deep into this SONA and what it meant and what it means for us in the future, and to exchange ideas and recommendations on helping the new administration accomplish its plans in this post-pandemic Philippines. I'm Tony Abad, and I will be your moderator and host, and we will have a selection of very well selected set of speakers. Each speaker has 12 minutes to make a presentation, but we do have an open forum where you have an opportunity to engage and discuss with our speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for today. I think certainly not a stranger to the Strat-based ADR events, Dr. Francisco, or Kiko Magno, is a professor of political science and development studies at De La Salle University, and also was the former chairperson of the political science department of the same university, and the former director of the Social Development Research Center at the same university as well. Dr. Magno is a trustee and a program convener at the Strat-based ADR Institute. And I remember Kiko being a regular guest also over at Bloomberg TV when we used to have it. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kiko Magno. Kiko.
Thank you, Tony, for that introduction, generous introduction. So let me share my screen right now. So let me proceed. I've been given the topic governance and development. What have we learned? So I would like to focus, given the limited time available, President Marcos emphasized the delivery of better government services. But I would like to contextualize this topic, and I think it's a good focus area, considering that government effectiveness in the Philippines, based on the world governance indicators that the Philippine government is actually using. It's part of the Philippine Development Plan. So in terms of government effectiveness, over the past 5 years, we have really declined in terms of performance. Recuperated a bit in 2020, but it's really a declining trend over the years, which places us in this list of ASEAN countries in the lower half of countries. Together with our poorer neighbors in ASEAN, we were actually ahead of Vietnam and even Indonesia a couple of years ago. But as you can see, it's not a good performance. So the president, I think, made a very strong pitch for a digital Philippines. And in fact, of course, this is something that we don't want to hear, taxes. So he emphasized that digital services taxes would be imposed. And this comes together with digital government services. I'll focus more on the digital government services. And I actually support his proposal, legislative priority to have an e-government act, because it will support the pitch for government effectiveness that can be enhanced with the passage of an e-government or e-governance act. So I was wondering whether these two proposals can be consolidated, an e-government act and an e-governance act. And this would enable interoperability of government data and processes to foster efficiency in the delivery of services. E-governance can promote interoperability, remove silos, streamline processes, and address functional overlaps. In fact, I put this in my chapter that Strat-based ADRi published. And this is part of the section on governance agenda for post-COVID-19 recovery. But let me now go to what's missing in the SONA, in the address of the president. When he discussed a digital Philippines, he failed to discuss open government data, because open government data concerns information that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed. The release data is available online to allow the public to access it without having to pay fees. So a push for digital Philippines should also foster transparency. A few years ago, we have this open data portal, but it has not been updated, and there are data files on public expenditures and other information from government and various agencies that can be uploaded, but I don't think this is being updated right now. Another aspect is e-participation. And this might come within the notion of e-governance. So if these two proposed bills will not be consolidated, so e-participation can be part of e-governance. Under the program, a set of online tools will give citizens access to government information, space for consultation, and a platform for collaboration. So I'm mentioning this because this has been started, little steps. But the president could have reiterated this, and in fact, a strong pitch, because we are entering the budget season, so support for this effort should be made as part of the SONA. And certainly, this is not part of the president's speech. A Freedom of Information bill has always been filed in every Congress, but nothing has moved very much. Under the previous government, there was an executive order providing freedom of information, a freedom of information policy applied to executive departments. I say this because an FOI law would mandate the disclosure of public documents. The proposed bill can outline the exceptions for public disclosure and procedures for accessing public documents. So the president has really vowed to address health issues, bring healthcare closer to the people. And in fact, there was much applause regarding this, the delivery of this section of the speech. But again, he failed to mention the corruption risks that emerged, especially during the pandemic years that, and we are still in the pandemic, of course. But during the pandemic years, of the first 2 years, the risk areas include the withholding of accurate health data, irregularities in public procurement, purchase of substandard equipment, and misappropriation of health budgets. In fact, Congress investigated all these corruption allegations. And yet the SONA speech was silent with respect to corruption risk. I'm trying to wind down this presentation given the limited time, but the second key area is the control of corruption. This is still part of the World Governance Indicators, which we actually use in our Philippine Development Plan. And as you can see, we are really performing badly in this area. And as Professor Dean Dumanhit mentioned, this is an urgent national concern that has been expressed by Filipino citizens. And that places us in the bottom half of the list of ASEAN countries. So we are, in terms of percentile rank, we are not ranking very well. So how do we fight corruption? It requires a comprehensive approach that the current government has not expressed any plan on how to fight corruption. So it's not just prosecution, but it should include corruption prevention strategies that will reduce monopoly power, limit and clarify discretion, and promote transparency and accountability in governance. I think this is very much part of the effort to level the playing field, but it has to be raised. And what are some of the bills that can be promoted or pushed? Strengthening the ombudsman. There's a need for the institutional strengthening of the Office of the Ombudsman by upgrading employee skills, augmenting compensation and benefits, and enhancing its fiscal autonomy. The agency is hampered by the lack of lawyers and other resources given its workload. There's also the failure to mention the citizen participatory audit, which has been mainstream in the Commission on Audit program, but it lacks budget support. Integrity development can also be pursued through the passage of the Civil Service Code, which would address deeply rooted problems besetting the public service, such as corruption, red tape, violations of employee rights, and weak organizational effectiveness. This has been mentioned by the President, but perhaps the framing could be enhanced by relating it to vertical and horizontal accountability, so that the barriers and distortions in intergovernmental relations could be addressed, including the unclear roles of different government levels, fragmented relations, and poor fiscal responsibilities of local government units. So there is a need to address these governance gaps. And a lot has been said about the whole of government approach. So this has to be contextualized and specified, and the participation of citizens should be addressed, and the policy environment as well. And finally, given the Mandanas ruling that is going to be implemented fully this year, and the Mandanas ruling provides for greater fiscal transfers to local government units. So SDG localization might be a good thing to push, so that SDG localization can be done in the context of the need to mobilize research capacity, analyze data, harness technology, and build knowledge partnerships to generate solutions to real-world problems. I think this can easily be connected to what has been mentioned in terms of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Amid the Fourth Industrial Revolution, LGUs need to become smarter, sustainable, and responsive to the needs of the citizens. The localization of SDGs and its attainment would involve the creation of smart, inclusive, and resilient LGUs that rely on open data and governance innovations that address citizen demand for better public services. So in this presentation, what I actually did was to connect with the SONA discussion of the President, focusing on the digital Philippines, but it is incomplete. And I hope this presentation can help this government really strengthen its pursuit of providing better government services. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiko, for your discussion on governance and development. What have we learned? We move on to the next speaker, who also happens to be my boss at the Foundation for Economic Freedom, to discuss moving forward through strategic economic reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Calixto Toti Chiquiamco is the president of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, a public advocacy organization dedicated to advancing the cause of economic and political liberty, good governance, and secure and well-defined property rights, market-oriented reforms, and consumer protection. He is also a board member of IDEA, or the Institute for Development and Econometric Analysis, and a columnist at Business World. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from President Toti.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I'm glad to see that you're well and safe.
Thank you.
Well, the topic that was given to me is, the structural reform agenda. It's by no means complete. My presentation by no means complete because, of course, we have limited time. I did not touch on things like health and even fisheries, which I'm not so familiar with. It's called, structural reforms because I believe these are the reforms needed to put the country on a sustainable growth track. In other words, these are the reforms that will be transformational. Okay, we can move on. And yeah, so this will cover agriculture, forestry, labor, connectivity, public-private partnership, pro-competition, education, and energy. As I said, some areas like health, I did not touch on. Well, first of all, on agriculture, what are the main things that we have to do? I think we need to pass a successful Farmers Development Act. Well, the president in his SONA mentioned about debt condonation, but I think debt condonation is not enough. I mean, it should be used as an opportunity to make the other reforms needed. And what we need to do is really to modernize agriculture, to change it from being a traditional and small scale to one that is more modern and toward more commercial agriculture. So what are the features of this? We increase land retention limit from 5 hectares to 24 hectares. A debt condonation, because this will help free up the leasing market, because right now about 644,000 hectares are prohibited from being sold or even leased, because the agrarian reform beneficiaries still owe some money to the government. And the coverage should be limited to 1 year only instead of being indefinite. In other words, if the government does not able to acquire the land within 1 year, then the coverage is terminated. Number 4, is to certify the certificate of landowner into fee simple titles instead of clause with so many restrictions. And lastly, the removal of the Department of Agrarian Reform clearances for agricultural land transfer monitoring activities to the land, and transferring monitoring activities to the Land Registration Authority, which is the database. As you know, clearances from DAR has been a main obstacle to having a freer rural land market, no? And they do not have a database anyway to be able to say that you're owning more than 5 hectares. So another reform bill that we need to pass, and I think Congressman Joey Salceda has said that he will file this, is a livelihood development bill. Essentially to abolish quantitative restrictions for corn, pork, chicken, and tarify imports. And use the tariff revenues for a competitiveness fund for the producers. For forestry, I include forestry because this has always been a neglected part. We always mention agriculture, but forestry is should be a big part because 1 out of 4 poor people live in the uplands. And the president talked about having green jobs and having a green economy. And I think we cannot do that without reforming our forestry sector. One is we need a tree growing agreements bill so that to treat planted trees as personal property. In other words, treat planting trees as if you are planting vegetables. So that will lead to many well, there may be many implications of this. First of all, you'll not be subject to log bans. Secondly, these trees will become securitizable and bankable. And finally, foreigners will be allowed to invest in tree plantation because trees will no longer be considered part of the land, but be considered personal property. And of course, the government should earn some stumpage fees from the using of forest lands. The other reform in forestry that we need to do is to create a Forest Land Cadastral Act, which will create a public record of claims and interests of the forests. As of now, there is no such public record. We have for our agricultural lands, we have, of course, titles. You can get that from the Land Registration Authority or the Registry of Deeds, but not for claims in the forest. So we propose to create a Forest Land Cadastral Act. With the forest cadastre, we'll be able to banks will be able to verify all claims and interests in the forest. Okay, let's move on because I think we have a limited time. Labor, this is a must. I think we need an apprenticeship program reform well, first of all, right now it's limited only to technical industries. Apprenticeship should cover all industries, and it should be extended from just 6 months to at least 2 years, because 6 months is just not enough to be able to train people, especially in technical occupations. And then, of course, the other reform is amendments to the Job Start Act, extend from 6 months to at least a year. Another idea in labor reform is to create labor employment zones where firms, if they locate there, will be exempt from the minimum wages in areas of high unemployment, but it should be closed shop. That means the workers automatically members of unions. The other proposal to also amend the labor code is portability of pensions in exchange for liberalization of labor security provisions. Portability of pensions, because right now, if you resign from a firm, you are not able to bring your seniority with you to the other firm that you'll be transferring to. Connectivity, I think we should pass an Open Access in Data and Transmission Act. All right, let's move on. Public-private partnership, I think the president has mentioned PPP as a mode for financing infrastructure projects, but I don't think investors will come in under the revised IRR of the BOT, and therefore I think there's a need to amend the BOT law IRR, which was just changed just before President Duterte left office. We should amend the MAGA provisions, the big provisions on rate of return, and exemption of the government projects from arbitration. So another pro-competition reform that we have to do is, of course, The big one, which is charter change. Remove the Filipino first and Filipino only provisions in the Constitution. Corollary to that, there should be amendment in our procurement laws. Basically, Commonwealth Act 541. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And also the flag law and LOI 630 and the Government Procurement Act. Because all of this institutionalize a Filipino first policy in which government institutions are mandated to choose the Filipino supplier even if they are 15% more expensive. So this leads really to budgetary waste, and at the same time does not make our Filipino firms competitive. Education, I think we need to repeal the Free Tertiary Education Act, the Free College Tuition Law. Studies have shown that it has not been inclusive, that actually those enrolling in state institutions are actually from the middle class and upper middle class, and I think a better system would be to give scholarships to the poor. We should also review the curriculum and teachers training and expand scholarships for the poor, and expand the voucher system. As far as energy is concerned, one major reform that I think we should do is to amend the IRR to allow 100% foreign investment in solar and wind. Because right now, the IRR of the DOE states that solar and wind are natural resources, which has no legal basis. So this is one low-hanging fruit that the present administration can harvest by allowing liberalization of renewable energy. So that's my final slide. For those who are interested in one, they can look at my book, which is available in Lazada and Shopee. Thank you.
Thank you, Toti. And we'll take note of the books and promote them. And I hope to discuss with you later more in depth, the structural reforms you're pushing for under this new administration. So we now move on to our next speaker, who will be talking about public sector governance and the national budget. This is very, very important, very timely, and I think something that we really have to watch out for. Our next speaker is Ms. Zaiza Nadine Suzara, Executive Director of the Institute for Leadership, Empowerment, and Democracy, or iLead, which is a non-stock, non-profit policy think tank that focuses on public finance, good governance, and strengthening democratic institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Zaiza Nadine Suzara.
Good morning. I wanted to thank first StratBase for inviting me here again to talk about how the public budget or the national budget really relates to governance, and try to connect that with my critique of the SONA the other day. So this will just be short. Basically, my outline is just a sort of introduction, which actually Professor Dindo already presented when he began, when he opened the webinar. And then I go immediately to the critiques since we don't have time, and then conclude. But basically, I have four. I have comments on the MTFF, or the medium-term fiscal framework, the public spending priorities. I broke down the MTFF into public spending priorities, which is the expenditure side or the budget side of it. I also have some comments on the public finance, the debt, the deficit, revenues, and then finally try to tie it all up together public sector governance. So basically, when I was listening to the speech, I thought that it did not give enough context as to where we are right now as a nation. So just to, backtrack a little bit, and like I said, Professor Manhit already mentioned this a while ago, I tried to think about what the Marcos administration inherited in terms of our economy, in terms of the state, and in terms of society. So of course, we know what the consequences, what the impact of the pandemic is on our economy, but just some figures here. Although there are signs of rebound with the reopening of the economy, immediately we were faced with new challenges, global shocks, inflation, supply chain challenges because of the Russia-Ukraine war, and then we're faced now as well with the weak peso. And the consequences, of course, is that we had higher debt and deficit despite improvements in revenue collection, actually, since we started to reopen the economy. So total debt is projected to be at 13.4 trillion pesos by the end of 2022. This is not mentioned in the SONA. The debt to GDP ratio is currently at 63.5 as of the first quarter of 2022. President Marcos said his economic managers will try to bring it down to less than 60% by 2025. But let's see if that's realistic, as I will present later the entire fiscal program. And then the deficit is pegged at 1.7 trillion pesos, which is equivalent to 7.6% of GDP for 2022. And they said by the end of his term, it's going to return to about 3% of GDP. And in terms of the national budget, and I've discussed this in other strat-based fora, basically the 2021 budget, which is still valid until the end of December, and the 2022 budget, which is valid until the end of 2023, are not designed for economic recovery. And we've consistently seen this since the start of the pandemic. In fact, the 2022 budget is most of all an election budget, not really a budget that is designed for economic recovery. In terms of our society, of course, we know unemployment rate is higher, underemployment rate is higher. So that's about 2.9 million Filipinos unemployed, 6.7 million Filipinos who are underemployed still want to work. More Filipinos are poorer now. There's lower vaccination, lower achievement of the vaccination rate targets. There's a crisis in education. There's a crisis in transportation. And with respect to the state, obviously we know of this whole phenomena under the Duterte administration's term of democratic backsliding, a lot of corruption issues, and a lot of inefficiency in the bureaucracy. So my first point, going into the critique, is that the medium-term fiscal framework was thoroughly discussed, but the president failed to present a coherent strategic vision of development for economy, state, and society. It was steeped in details. We'll give him that. But it was difficult for me to imagine where the MTFF will lead us. So for me, achieving the MTFF is not an end in itself, but it is a means to shape economy, society, and the state. And that is what I did not see from the SONA. He also emphasized at the start of his speech when he was discussing the medium-term fiscal framework that he will pursue expenditure management. But this is a paradox. He is a continuity president. And the rest of his speech is basically a continuation of the Duterte budget priorities, that President Duterte supposedly stellar legacy when it comes to infrastructure development. And so again, while those priorities were steeped in technical details, his ambitious priorities actually reflect the same budget priorities outlined by the Duterte administration for 2023. And then when I show you later the budget priorities framework, it's as if he just read from that document. He also promised to bring down debt and deficit by the close of his term, but with the revenue neutral tax reform package, and taxes on digital services projected to reach 11.3 billion pesos, how is that going to be enough to finance a budget that will reach 7 trillion pesos by the end of his term? So these are big, tough, and difficult questions for the economic managers to answer. And lastly, there were no references to democratic norms such as upholding the rule of law or strong commitment to good governance. So like I said, the MTFF is just a means to an end. What do these numbers mean? What is his strategic vision for the Philippines? What will Philippine economy, state, and society look like once these targets are achieved? I mean, it's not enough to just achieve these targets, but what is it going to lead us to? What development outcome? What will the Philippines look like by the end of his term? And I said, with respect to the public spending priorities, I really found this kind of funny. The SONA did sound impressive because it was a lot of technical details, a lot of ambitious promises. But when I looked at the 2023 budget priorities framework, trying to see how Marcos will depart from Duterte's budget priorities, I saw the exact same spending priorities. So why is he even talking about expenditure rate realignment? The third point on public finance and debt. Yeah, I already mentioned the planned spending of 5 trillion to 7 trillion pesos. We know that the debt to GDP ratio is high. We know that the deficit is also high. In the meantime, that no new taxes are imposed, how is the administration going to fund those ambitious priorities, given that the Mandanas ruling already ate up the fiscal space of the national government? How will they lower the debt and the deficit? And again, it's not just the Mandanas ruling that has a great fiscal impact on our national budget and public sources of financing, but the unreformed military pension system, which of course is never mentioned in the speech. And my last point with respect to public sector governance, without a strong commitment to good governance and anti-corruption, it will be difficult to achieve expenditure results, fiscal sustainability, and better yet, meaningful development outcomes for our country. The Philippine bureaucracy continues to face a lot of structural challenges. So even if we have a list of really nice programs, really good targets, the fact is government agencies have poor absorptive capacity. And this can be seen in lower budget utilization rates, poor planning and budgeting linkage, technical deficits in the procurement process, delays in project implementation leading to lower disbursements, which is of course supposed to fuel economic growth. So there's no mention of all of these challenges. Meanwhile, the budget is going to continue to grow. 5 trillion to 7 trillion pesos is a lot. And this is not what the bureaucracy is used to absorbing. So for me, cash-based budgeting, which he did say is going to be part of a reform once the budget modernization bill is passed, will not frontally address these problems. And right sizing may help, but it's going to be a long and tedious process, which I don't think the administration can finish even by the end of its term. It's a complicated process, although I do agree that it is necessary, especially in the context of pursuing full devolution because of the Mandanas Garcia ruling. And again, lastly, there's no strong commitment to tackle corruption, but he did mention e-government, e-governance. Maybe that could help, but transparency and accountability, as Dr. Magno mentioned, open government as well, these are not part of the SONA. FOI was not mentioned as a legislative priority, and it remains to be seen how this administration sees civil society. There's some indication that it's willing to work with the business sector via the PPPs. But what about civil society? Is it going to open up spaces for participatory governance? And so with all of that, I think what we can say is that the Marcos administration inherited deficits. And it's not just a fiscal deficit. It is a deficit in terms of democratic governance. And as a continuity president, I'm actually more curious about how he's going to plug these deficits. Addressing the fiscal deficit is contingent on addressing the deficits in democratic governance left by the Duterte administration. And lastly, I just want to reiterate that the medium-term fiscal framework is a set of targets. Achieving those numbers with respect to the debt, the disbursements, the revenues will not necessarily translate into more equitable and inclusive economic recovery if he doesn't have such vision. So with that, I end my presentation, and thank you again to StratBase for giving ID the opportunity to participate in this webinar.
Thank you very much, Saiza. I think you have very valid comments on the SONA and the overall vision of this administration. Something that we should discuss at the next at the open forum. Sorry. All right, we move on, and our next speaker is going to talk about interweaving poverty and inequality reduction reforms. Dr. Ron Mendoza is the former dean of the Ateneo School of Government and a fellow faculty member at the Ateneo de Manila University. He is a governance and institutional reform specialist with over 25 years of experience in development policy and public administration reforms. And he's now the chief of party of an interesting project called Participate. And in connection with that, I understand that he is all the way in far off Tawi-Tawi. We'll still try to connect with us both by video and hopefully online. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our next speaker with his presentation, Dr. Ron Mendoza.
Provide some initial reactions to the address. It's his first, and he's in a Duterte budget, as well as that the new administration must address. My initial reactions are as follows. First, he was quite honest in identifying that the country faces challenges. Some his State of the Nation address, and many of our economic policy reforms, as well as the economic reform agenda. And I believe he framework, the regular. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join you, and so I pre-recorded my contribution to the discussions, which I hope is somehow useful. Dindo asked me to provide some initial reactions to the President's State of the Nation address. It's his first, and he's inheriting a Duterte budget, as well as many challenges that the new administration must address. My initial reactions are as follows. First, he was quite honest in identifying that the country faces significant challenges, some due to external factors and others due to our own doing. And I believe this is an honest assessment. He also strategically used Filipino and English in his State of the Nation address. And for me, this catered to different audiences, which he appeared to be trying to reach out to. In English, he conveyed many of our economic policy reforms, as well as the economic reform agenda. And I believe he's conversing with investors in this section. And he wanted them to hear about the economic framework, the regulatory direction, and plus the determined pandemic exit that the Marcos administration will likely push. On the other hand, for issues such as agriculture, OFWs, and many other issues related to high prices, as well as joblessness, President Marcos spoke in Filipino, and I believe he is trying to reach out to our fellow Filipinos who want to hear about the government's response to issues such as inflation, joblessness, social protection, and so on and so forth. In his SONA, he provided some reassuring specificity. These were more specific policy reforms, policy directions, and even some legislative measures that he mentioned. This was largely lacking in his communication when he was running for office. And this SONA is an opportunity to put more specificity in many of these areas. And I believe he took advantage of it and sent a good signal on many fronts on the concrete reforms that are now being explored and pushed. There were also a lot of figures and targets in the SONA, which is quite reassuring. Among the targets, he noted 6.5 to 7.5% real gross domestic product growth in 2022, and to be pushed forward into 2023 and into 2028, the range of 6 to 8% growth, 9% single-digit poverty rate by 2028, 3% national government deficit to GDP ratio by 2028, less than 60% national government debt to GDP ratio by 2025, and at least $4,256 income GNI per capita, and the attainment of upper middle income country status by 2024. He also mentioned that he wanted this growth to take place outside of Manila as well, which signals well in terms of promoting inclusive development. He then spent a lot of time discussing agriculture, which is, in my view, a good sign. It signals a strong political commitment on his part, and the fact that he took on the assignment as Acting Secretary of Agriculture is also, I believe, a good sign. He made interesting promises and policy directions on land distribution and utilization. But I believe one of the key reforms that he signaled, which is a good sign, is the emphasis on the land use law. He did have some inconsistencies, tax and spending efficiency plus government right sizing. He sent this signal of an effort to increase efficiency and effectiveness in the public sector. But then he also talked about new agencies that will actually potentially also put some pressure on the government to set aside more resources for these agencies and programs. He mentioned the Department of Water, new programs like ROTC and Kadiwa, plus a number of agricultural support measures, and of course, promises of government support to various sectors, as well as subsidies. So my view is that it's a little bit mixed on that front. There is a signal that the government will push for increased efficiency in the public sector. On the other hand, there was also a signal of increased spending, increased investments in other areas. What that will result in likely is a challenge for balancing priorities, as well as a drive to improve governance, particularly in tax collection, as well as in spending efficiency, lessening leakages and focusing spending on key areas. I'd like to end by mentioning notable items that he did not mention, or he mentioned a lot less. One is anti-corruption and good governance, although he did mention e-governance. And this is at least a good sign that there is an opening for the improved governance brought about by an electronic government platform and increased efficiency in public services due to these types of investments. He also did not mention so much Mindanao. In fact, if I recall correctly, he only mentioned Mindanao in the context of the Mindanao Railway. And he also did not mention BARM and peace, which are among the legacies of the Duterte administration, which has been started but necessarily needs to be continued and strengthened, particularly with the transition in BARM taking place. I want to thank Dindo Manhit and colleagues in ADRi for the kind invitation to provide this input in today's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I'm not sure, I'm not certain, but I hope that Ron can join us for the open forum. Again, raised some important points. Towards the end, he was talking about peace and about BARM in Bangsamoro. I think are very important topics that should be mentioned in any agenda of any administration. And so we move on. Again, another, I would say, suki, or another fixture, no, of our strat-based ADRi events, and also various events dealing with political reform in the country. And a good friend, we have our next speaker on reconsidering patronage politics and political reforms. Dr. Julio, or July Tihanki, is a professor of political science and international studies and former dean of the College of Liberal Arts at De La Salle University. He has served as, he served as president of Asian Political and International Studies Association and Philippine Political Science Association. I think I have learned a lot already regarding political science. We've had various exchanges way back. I think when we still had Bloomberg TV also. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome another important thought leader for this discussion, Dr. July Tihanki. July, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony. I'd like to share my screen. Okay, I'd like to thank Stratbase, ADRi, especially my good friend and colleague Dindo Manhit, for again inviting me to share my thoughts this morning. The victory of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in the 2022 presidential elections was indeed unprecedented, with 31 million or 59% of the votes won. The son and namesake of the late strongman emerged as the first majority president under the Fifth Republic. Now, for most of us, the question is, will his victory strengthen the Fifth Republic, or will this Marcos restoration mark the end of the Fifth Republic. Now, elections, especially when it's perceived to be free, fair, and honest, are crucial for the functioning of a democracy. From the perspective of majoritarian democracy, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., despite his family's authoritarian legacy, won the presidency because majority rule is the only game in town. But majoritarian democracy does not mean we have a strong and consolidated democracy. The Philippines takes pride in being the oldest democracy in Asia, and yet its quality of democracy has long been held in doubt. What exists in this country is what we often call an elite democracy, a democracy dominated by the elites of wealth and the elites of power. Moreover, Philippine democracy can also be described as a patronage democracy, now used generally to describe democracies that rely on the distribution of material benefits or patronage in mobilizing voter support. The victory of Marcos Jr. was a result of the astute use of social media propaganda and the consolidated support of the country's political and economic elites. Majority of the political families and dynasties supported the Marcos Duterte unity ticket. The same dynasties that have constantly shifted support from GMA to Noynoy to Duterte. It is therefore no surprise that BBM did not mention political and electoral reforms in his first State of the Nation address. Even charter change was not in his radar screen, despite his party being the Partido Federal ng Philippines. Now, institutionalism in the literature of political science posits that institutions matter since it consists of the rules of the game. But changing institutions or the rules is always difficult. Both the protracted incremental approach, such as trying to pass the constitutional ban on political dynasties, and the wholesale shotgun approach, such as all the proposals in the past administrations for charter change. All have been tried and yet failed. Given the current situation and the current political balance of power, it seems that the situation does not augur well with most of the reform advocacies that have been proposed in the past. So, I would like to suggest a different and more practicable approach to addressing most of these political and even electoral problems or issues. The order or sequencing of reforms is critical in institutionalism. Learning from past efforts at reform advocacies, I propose working from the minimal practicable reforms, working up to the more complex and widespread changes. In the first order, at least within the next 3 to 6 years, reform advocates should lobby or should campaign for a revisiting of main agents of political contestation in the country, the political parties. In the second order, we should consider overhauling the way we conduct elections by totally changing our current election code. And lastly, if we succeed in these two reforms, perhaps, and if this administration is really interested in it, we can actually consider the wholesale reforms through constitutional change. I have three proposals. One is to unbundle the Political Party Development Act, the bill that has been languishing in Congress since 2003. Now, this bill, while it attempts to strengthen political parties in the country, tries to come out with a package that covers four major reforms, including the contentious issue of campaign finance reform, state subsidy to political parties, a ban on party switching, and strengthening citizen parties linkage. My proposal is just focus on the reform that can get support even from the political dynasties themselves. And I consider the ban on party switching might be of interest even to the members of political families and dynasties, because it will work to the advantage of those who are already part of established political parties. And, you know, if we focus on this reform that can even get the support of the political dynasties, such as the ban on party switching, then strengthening political parties might be the first real step at realizing political reforms. And this is one way of perhaps taming the political dynasties in the country. My second proposal is to change the Omnibus Election Code, or Batas Pambansa 881. Our election code is already 37 years old. Much of its provisions are obsolete. It was designed for manual voting, not automated elections. And it is full of loopholes, especially on campaign finance and spending. Much of the problems and issues that we have encountered in previous electoral cycles can be traced to the basic weakness and flaws of the existing omnibus election code. So, lastly, if the Marcos administration would also consider charter change, it should be done through a constitutional convention. This might be the also an imperfect way of doing it, but it's the most legitimate mode of constitutional change. So I'd like to end with these three proposals, and I'm looking forward to your questions in the open forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, July. That was short and sweet, and you raised, I think, my favorite topic now, which is constitutional reform. And we'll certainly touch on it during the open forum. And now we come to our last, certainly not our least, of our speakers, who is going to now, well, round off our discussions, our presentations with the topic Prospects for Democracy and the Rule of Law in the Next Decade. Dr. Imelda Dainla is the convener of BOSES, Opinion, Siyasat at Siyensya para sa Pilipinas, or BOSES Pilipinas. So she's the boss of BOSES, the first university-based opinion and survey research unit established in the Philippines that aims to advance empirical, interdisciplinary, and policy-oriented studies of public opinion on democracy, governance, and development. Something that perhaps, Doctor, I'd like to discuss with you later on. She also happens to be a fellow faculty at the Ateneo de Manila University as an associate professor of the Ateneo School of Government. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Dr. Imelda Dainla.
Thank you, Dean Tony Abad, for that kind introduction. Magandang umaga po sa lahat. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to StratBase for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas about the SONA. So let me first share my let me just share my Share screen. Okay. Oh no. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. It seems that for some reason I have difficulty. Maybe I'll share. I'm sorry, I'm not able to share my my PowerPoint for some reason.
Dr. Dinla, I can share it for you.
Okay, all right. Sorry about this mishap. This is small mishap. I can send this in a bit. Okay, sorry about this. This won't take long. China, is that you? Kim, can I send this to you, Kim?
Yes, pa.
For some reason, I was able to share this a while back. Okay. Oh my goodness. So sorry about this. Oh gosh. Jaina, how can I send this quickly to you through
You can send it to sa email.
Okay. I shouldn't be panicking.
Pero okay pa. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. So I think I sent it to you already. I actually won't be long with the presentation because most of the speakers actually covered this topic. So as what Dean Tony said, this is merely to round off key issues or ideas about democracy and the rule of law. Okay. All right. Actually, I managed to share it. Sorry.
Okay pa.
Okay. So these are merely 3 points that I'd like to discuss. One is that there are serious issues and challenges to Philippine democracy and the rule of law that some of the speakers had already discussed, and that there is a need to address the continuing backsliding or regression on democratic and rule of law deficits. But however, there are opportunities for addressing these deficits in terms of various aspects of democracy and rule of law in the Philippines. Let me show you this graph by International IDEA. I have had the opportunity to work on the state of democracy on the Asia Pacific with International IDEA, an international nonprofit organization, intergovernmental organization that tracks the progress or regressions on different aspects of democracy across the world. So unlike other indicators, International IDEA doesn't rank the countries, but it does track the performance of countries on democracy in terms of representativeness of government, meaning the quality of electoral democracy, fundamental rights, access to justice, civil liberties, social inclusion and equality, checks on government. Basically, these are the constraints on government powers, no? Ensuring separation of powers, but also ensuring that governments, particularly the executive, do not abuse their powers. Impartial administration in terms of absence of corruption and predictable enforcement, and participatory engagement in terms of the capacity of civil society organizations to participate, in terms of the public to participate in electoral and other political processes through direct democracy and local democracy. As we can see in the graphs on the right side, we can see that the Philippines are in the company of countries that have exhibited significant backsliding in the past 10 years or so. From 2000 in the past 5 years, we can see that the Philippines actually ranked number 3, no, in terms of regression in democracy and across all of these parameters. A key significant aspect of this backsliding or regression or democratic regression is actually is shown in the significant declines on checks on government, fundamental freedoms, and impartial administration. This graph is merely to illustrate that similar to Sri Lanka, which is now currently undergoing massive civil unrest, no, and economic failure, the Philippines, if you can see, has a massive decline in terms of effective parliament, judicial independence, and media integrity. It only goes to show that the executive has gone really powerful, and mostly its powers remain unchecked, and there are significant issues as to the exercise of this power. There are also similar alarming trends in terms of the rule of law indices, and in this table, I am showing the World Justice Project ranking of the Philippines in 2021. In terms of the overall global rank, the Philippines ranks 102 out of 139. In terms of the Philippines overall regional rank, it ranks 13 out of 15. It means really that in terms of the regional rank, meaning it includes the Asia Pacific region, the Philippines really is at the bottom list, no, in terms of our rule of law ranking. We can see here the indices used by the World Justice Project: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. We can see from this table is that the Philippines has actually achieved significant regression when it comes to fundamental rights. And in the reports in the international IDA, it actually singled out the Philippines and India as two of the countries that have had very high-handed implementation of lockdown measures that often resulted to cruelty and deaths to ordinary Filipinos. Of course, not to mention, no, the fact that, and it is shown in terms of the low scores on order and security, despite the implementation of again, very high-handed implementation of law and order policy, insecurity is still very much prevalent in the Philippines. And of course, the prevalence of violence in its many forms, of course, including extrajudicial killings that have been noted already by international organizations, including the International Criminal Court. We can see that there is also significant declines in civil justice and criminal justice. So this is not just merely the presence of courts or conflict resolution mechanisms, but also the accessibility, no, of these mechanisms to people, and that these mechanisms can actually be used effectively, efficiently by the people. That there is no corruption involved in using these mechanisms. So we can see that there are really significant challenges on rule of law on the Philippines. Of course, we know that apart from all of these factors, the impact, there is that corrosive impact of mis or disinformation on democracy in the Philippines. And we have shown through our research at that Boses Pilipinas how the extent of vulnerability of the Philippine youth, but also more broadly, the general public on mis and disinformation. We have found in our research, in our own research, how mis or disinformation has heightened political polarization and social divides among Filipinos. And we have seen that in the kinds of not just rhetoric, but also vile exchanges, anger, hatred against Filipinos. And that we know that misinformation has become a big threat to deliberative democracy. So the same kind of corrosive falsehoods, tweaking or a distorting of history and information that we saw in the United States, we have also seen also in Philippine elections, starting in the 2016 and as well as in the past elections. We know that misinformation and disinformation can nullify vertical as well as and other forms of accountability, by distorting or influencing or shaping political behavior and attitudes, but also that's also seen in the way people still trust, certain personalities or institutions, despite the fact that perhaps those institutions are not actually performing quite well. We have seen also how misinformation and this polarization in the social media has actually engendered vigilante justice. We have seen that in what has happened at the Ateneo Law School with that assassination brought before the very gates in broad daylight of at the Ateneo. So there is really a need, an urgent need to arrest these continuing declines. If the current trend continues, then we can expect that the Philippines would actually belong to the top bottom in 6 years' time. Based on the World Justice Project Index, the Philippines has actually declined 3 ranks below. So if this trend continues for the next 6 years, then we might be in the company of countries that have really fallen at the bottom, and those countries are also countries that actually are in a state of civil unrest. Example, Myanmar, of course, countries with grave human rights violations, killings, extrajudicial killings, and impunity. So these are this will be the kind of situation that we will be facing if we don't do anything about this. We know that an unchecked executive could lead to greater concentration of powers, and that could lead to, of course, impunity, violence, lack of accountability, and as I mentioned, civil unrest. And these are all the hallmarks of countries that belong to the lower ranks of those indices that I have shown earlier. It is important to uphold the rule of law and democracy. Well, democracy because we are a democratic country. In fact, our current government has been elected by a strong mandate. And as already mentioned by other speakers, it is the foundation of good policies and good governance. And we know that all of those policies articulated in the SONA are targets or vision, no? But there is no foundation. If there is no foundation on how to do that, and that is the rule of law and democracy, then it is impossible to actually achieve those targets. However, we can see that there are certain opportunities to uphold or at least strengthen some aspects of the democracy and rule of law in the Philippines. As mentioned, there is strong mandate by the current government, by PBBM, and that he has articulated certain commitments in his SONA in terms of transparency and commitment to effective and efficient bureaucracy. However, as already articulated by other speakers, there is no strong commitment for strengthening democracy and rule of law. We have not heard so much about inclusion, participation, and gender, despite the fact that we have a vice president and some elected officials, women elected officials. In fact, we only have around 28% women senior leaders, in the government, in the legislature. So we need to do more, in terms of inclusivity, as well as really empowering more women in government. The president mentioned new branding for Filipinos to enhance its creativity and to make it like a world-class kind of creative citizens. However, I think it's really important for the government to also see the other side of what has happened in the Philippines, and that is the prevalence of killings, and that is shown in the extrajudicial killings, election violence. It continues to be a grave problem to the Philippines. So yes, it would be nice to rebrand the Philippines, into something more positive. But we need to address that negative aspect of the Philippines that we have known for in the past 6 years, as being one of the most violent countries in the world. Judiciary. I'm not sure if PBBM has mentioned, commitment to strengthen independence of the judiciary and its capacity, given the fact that we have really such a low score, in terms of criminal justice and civil justice. This is one of the things that maybe this current administration, and the current judiciary should really pay more attention to. This would also be the first time that the members of the judiciary are actually appointed. Most of them, if not all, I think except for 1 or 2, were appointed by previous administration. So this is the time for the judiciary to shine, to assert its independence. They don't owe their appointments to the current administration, and so we hope that they will fulfill their sworn duty and responsibility to uphold judicial independence. And of course, we need to promote confidence in the justice system, considering how vigilante killings had been engendered. And so we need to bring back that confidence in the justice system, and to ensure that our justice system actually works for everyone. I would like to mention about compliance, because most of the times the focus is more on enforcement. In fact, enforcement is on the end of law. You need to actually we need to actually be more promotive of procedural justice, rather than enforcement, and that includes impartial administration, to ensure that the government itself, shows the leadership, that it is actually enforcing law to everyone. There is no favoritism. There is level playing field. There is a lot of talk or promises on attracting foreign investments, but we need to ensure that the rules and laws are applied uniformly and without fear or favor. So let us also be reminded with SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And I think it was Professor Magno who was talking about localization of SDG. We can expect cooperation and participation from from the public, from the Filipinos, from civil society, if they have freedom from fear, violence, and insecurity. And so again, and what has been mentioned already by Professor Mendoza is that there was lack of mention of the Mindanao peace process, and this is one thing that has that the past administration, it was actually a legacy of the past administration, and that we hope that there is continuity on the process. There is a strong support on the way the peace process is being undertaken at the current period. So I think that's all for it, and thank you once again for this invitation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dainla. Now we will go to the open forum. I'm mindful that the time has we're delayed by about 20 minutes, so we'll try to adjust. We'll make slight adjustments towards the end, but we can't adjust that much. So we ask your indulgence and excuse us if well, not all questions can be accommodated. No? We already have a number of questions here in our Q&A box, and I will give out these questions, and well, I'll address them to all of you because I think these questions will apply to all of our speakers or maybe relevant to the topics that you've raised. Then if we have some time, I do have some questions of my own that I'd like to ask. I'm curious about how we can shape the government agenda at the end of this town hall meeting. So first of all, the SONA was a long laundry list of proposed legislation and initiatives. We have a question here. Which of these legislation do you see enjoying wide public support, or something that's popular and passing through Congress to become legislation soonest? So which are the laws that you see being passed quickest under this administration? And you may start with anyone in our panel. If not, I will recommend. I know, Toti, we've been talking about legislative agendas for a long time. It's not what we wish, but what do you think would come out sooner than the rest?
Well, of course, there are non-controversial bills that he mentioned there, like establishing a virology institute, some kind of center for disease control, those kinds of things. I think nobody will disagree with that. No.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those kinds will probably pass, but in my view, they are not transformational. They are not really going to move the needle a lot. No. Well, I hope that I do not know if there's a need for legislation. This is the amending the IRR on the PPP or the BOT, right? That's something that's to be done to make the investment climate more hospitable toward private sector participation. So that is within the control of the government. They can just have to conduct or issue an EO or conduct a very quick public consultation and amend that, because certainly that has to be changed, because those IRR had made I think investors think twice about taking advantage of the recently passed laws on liberalization to be able to invest in our infrastructure.
Toti, since we're talking about legislation and just a segue from this first question, what do you think about his pronouncements about land reform, meaning that he wanted to distribute the rest of the idle government lands for specifically for veterans or for certain target beneficiaries?
Well, if he's talking about public lands, that is not a problem. But the thing is, I think almost 3 million hectares have already been public lands subject to land reform. The problem of that is that those are all collective titles now. So in the government's previous government's desire to claim accomplishments, they just issued collective titles, which is now a problem. So I don't know. Perhaps they can continue with that, but they must make sure that that these are properly surveyed and partitioned accordingly. But as far as the private acquisition of private land is concerned, I think that's finished. No. I think with the end of Carper, that's been finished, and I think we should put a stop to that. I agree though with the debt condonation, but because this will free up the rural leasing market, because right now about 75% of agrarian reform beneficiaries are unable to pay, and therefore they cannot sell or lease their lands. So if you want to promote land consolidation through leasing, this can't be done right now without that debt condonation. However, the debt condonation should be used as an opportunity to make other reforms in our comprehensive agrarian reform law. For example, increasing the land retention limit to 24 hectares, for example. So I think they should be able to, while I agree with that, they should be able to package that with other reforms.
Thank you, Toti. Anyone else have opinions on this first question? If not, I have the second question, and I'd like to direct this to our speakers who are particularly concerned about the democratic space and the rule of law. So Dr. Dainla, July, or Kiko might be interested in this. What is your suggestion or recommendation to critics and opposition of the administration in contributing to this new government's agenda? Dr. Dainla? You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Dean Tony. Yeah, that's just a very good question. I think in my last slide, I emphasized that, and I think that's also a commitment by PBBM in terms of inclusion and unity. I think it is now the right time to make good on that promise. So I think the first task actually would be to enable, to ensure that the civil society organizations and the opposition do not feel fear or insecurity, and they're not under threat of violence. So I think there is really a need to address the polarization that has happened in the past several years. And I hope that the administration should also offer itself, for reconciliation, or maybe that's a trite word to say, but it is now the time. Of course, we need to empower them. How can they be empowered if there is always the threat, of litigation, of threats and harassment? But of course, on the part of the opposition, it's also the right time to also to be more constructive, on its proposals. Maybe it can, exercise, for example, direct democracy by proposing legislation, by participating in the deliberations in Congress, but also in continuing its task in making the government to be more transparent and to account for its actions. So it's a two-way process, and I think one of the key here as well is the role of misinformation and disinformation, because it distorts the process, but it also hinders engagement between these camps. So I think we need to put a stop, or to address the continuing prevalence of misinformation and disinformation, and that is on both sides. So that there is space for dialogue.
I think that's a valid point. No, maybe we're not really talking about it that much, but we have to really stand up and defend the truth and the sharing of information. But let's hope that there won't be efforts to try and distort, and squash.
Tony?
Yes, Kiko.
Yes, may I add on what Imelda said?
Yes, please.
On disinformation or misinformation. So misinformation, yung nagkamali, akala ko ganito pala. Yung disinformation, deliberate. So what we need are knowledge institutions and policy think tanks to guide the public on how to deal with information and data. So these are what I call information intermediaries. So this will guide the public in understanding what's happening.
Okay.
And who are the ones shaping public opinion? In the digital world, we have a lot of social influencers. In fact, in a study of a program called Youth-Led, how the youth are getting their political and civic education, they're getting it from social media. And in this pandemic context, they're getting it from their family members. So tinatanong na ngayon yung mga nakatatanda, ano po ba yung nangyayari noong unang panahon? So parang experiential. So we need to educate those who are in their houses. And a lot of them are using social media. But of course, the role of also the traditional media. Nangihinayang nga ako na wala yung Bloomberg program ni Tony, because that provides a lot of public opinion and interpretation. So in a democratic governance context, I think that addresses also the other question. We have to remind the government that we are under the 1987 Philippine Constitution, which actually promotes democratic governance. That's why it's very important to bring back those key principles na nawala during the SONA. And the way I connected it is by riding on what the president said about the digital transformation, a digital Philippines, and participation is a large part of digital transformation. Because a lot of people are now online, and so you bring participation online through e-participation. But you cannot participate very well if you do not know how to participate. And do you have data that's available? That's why I emphasize open data. So government should push data to the public. Kung wala naman silang pinupush na supply, on the supply side, then the people should demand. Unfortunately, we don't have freedom of information law, but we have the Constitution, and we just support our legitimate institutions. Civil society should work with the legislature. Anyway, even though the politicians, legislators belong to parties, they are not actually familiar with what those parties stand for. And at the end of the day, in order to understand mention nga ni Toti, yung mas madaling intindihan, no? Yung marami kasing nakalista diyan mga technical, no? Kailangan rin ng mga legislators natin maintindihan yung mga technical aspects. So in the end, you rely on policy think tanks, knowledge institutions. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should take note of that. I'm sure Dindo has taken note of that. Zaiza, yes, you're raising your hand. Please.
Yes, actually just a bit more particular, more specific to what Dr. Din and Dr. Magno already said. I just wanted to highlight as well the role of participating directly in the budget process, because the budget is really at the center of fiscal policy and democratic governance. So at least for us in ILEAD, that's our focus, and we try to help other civil society organizations. We in fact convened the People's Budget Coalition. And since the pandemic started, we've been actively lobbying to Congress very specific budget proposals. So parang the difference and the value added, I guess, of ILEAD and the coalition is that we don't just give proposals, we put a number. We have a very specific budget proposal for each of the sectoral needs that we want to lobby for. For example, last year we put together, we're a multi-sectoral coalition that includes the Makati Business Club, networks involved in health, labor, education, even the 4Ps nanays. So we put up a budget proposal that amounted to 1 trillion pesos because we felt that the 2022 budget was not responsive. It was largely allocated for infrastructure, and so there were no allocations for things like wage subsidies, other forms of direct subsidy and ayuda. So we lobbied as a coalition to the Committee on Finance and the Senate, and we fortunately got at least, if I'm not mistaken, around 60 billion pesos. So it's still something compared to not doing anything and just letting the 1 trillion go to, like, almost half of it is for patronage driven projects. So at least in the previous Congress, there was that openness to listen to what civil society had to say. And so I think that's something that CSOs should work together towards. And one other thing, apart from looking at the budget and lobbying for more responsive budgets, is the procurement process. There's a provision in the GIPRA, or the Government Procurement Reform Act, that says civil society is supposed to monitor and participate in the procurement processes. But what I'm hearing from government is that no civil society organizations are really interested in that process, precisely because the procurement process is a highly technical process. So on our part, I guess, in civil society, there also needs to be, like what Dr. Magno said, some sort of knowledge building, knowledge development, and capacity development, so that we can more effectively participate in processes that are already legislated. I guess it's just a matter of reclaiming that space and capacitating ourselves as part of civil society. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaiza. Toti, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I know that good governance and also democracy deficits, etc., human rights are supposed to be the province of political scientists. But as an economist, I think all of that is a roots in our economy. So, for example, the problem of democratic deficit, part of that is rooted in the absence of a rural middle class. We just have widespread rural poverty, and therefore that's why there's a rule of the dynasties. We have to accept the fact that land reform has failed. It has failed to make our farmers richer. So we need to modernize our agricultural system, create a rural middle class to improve democracy, especially in the rural areas. Now, as far as the rule of law and all of that is concerned, again, the system is one of rent-seeking right now. There is an incentive to corrupt institutions so that in order to increase your profits. No, that is why there's a need to remove all the Filipino first and Filipino only provisions in our constitution, which hinders competition. What we need to do is to transition from a rent-seeking economy to a competitive capitalist economy. Make it more accountable to markets rather than to having regulated industries with a incentive to corrupt the institutions and do rent seeking.
Toti, do you think the SONA had elements that, I mean, or the SONA as a whole, did it indicate that we are we're still heading towards a pro-market and pro-competition economy?
Well, I think that was more of a technocratic document. The SONA was a it didn't have a a vision of how we will really move into a more inclusive, democratic, prosperous Philippines. I would have thought that since he had the mandate, that he said that we should change our constitution. And let us face it, 30 years after the 1987 Constitution, we find ourselves in this. Our democracy is very fragile. We have weak institutions. We have massive rural poverty. We have to overhaul that Constitution.
Yes.
So that's what I thought that he would have done rather than. But I think he's being very cautious, very conservative in the way he's approaching problems.
So you do agree, no? It's a rather conservative SONA, I think. Okay, before I go to July, I'm glad you brought up the Constitution, Toti, because that's what I wanted to ask July about. And I know July's been studying this very well. And I think what Toti is also mentioning that, we have to make this bridge between the political scientists and the economists. Is it, please confirm that we do, after all these years, we do have to do this landmark effort as a society to amend our constitution or to fix our constitution. And that it will make economic sense, that actually will improve our economy, will improve issues about poverty and also on the other side about participation, political parties, giving communities more voice. And European commentators tend to look at us and said, well, logically, we should actually be shifting to a federal and parliamentary system. But I wanted to get your comments on this. And shouldn't this be something that should be, like the top vision that should be in a SONA? No? Sige, July.
I was about to comment on the earlier comments, but since you've raised the question of constitutionalism, I'll try to address your question, Tony, on constitution. Yes, you are correct. We have had several attempts at constitutional change or charter change, and yet we have failed partly because of what is known as in Latin America as the politics of continuismo. There is this constitutional trauma, among those that underwent periods of authoritarianism or dictatorship. And it is because of this that there is that misgiving that any attempt to open the constitution would only lead to attempts at lifting term limits. So that's one of the main reasons why we have failed so far in addressing our constitution. But there are three aspects in every time the issue of charter change is raised. The process question, how are we going to change it? Con-com, or con-as? Constituent Assembly, con-con, Constituent Assembly, or People's Initiative. And then content, what provisions will be changed? Will it be political, shifting to federal, or parliamentary, or opening up the economy? and then the outcome, who will benefit. No? So that third aspect is always contentious because there's that suspicion that the incumbent will benefit. So these are the three main dynamics, no, at the efforts of constitutional change. Now, will this administration open the issue? Although there are some members of the current political coalition who are pushing for it, particularly those who were part of the immediately concluded administration, apparently this president is not giving us any signals that he is open to that possibility. While he has a tremendous political mandate, we doubt that given all the challenges, particularly in the economy and the pandemic response, exit, he will expend his political capital on a big project like constitutional reform. So I don't think this president will push for it, but his allies, members of his coalition, will still attempt to push for constitutional change. So that's the reason why, and of course, the fact that this president did not even mention political or electoral reforms in his SONA also indicates a state of mind. That while there are segments in the country and around the world who are quite worried about the state of democracy in this country, apparently it is not a concern for this administration. So it leaves those who organize groups, think tanks, academics, youth movements to push for the necessary reform. But what we have seen also is the consolidation of political elite rule in this country. I agree with Toti in the sense that this information played a big role, but not all the 31 million who voted for Bongbong Marcos were misled. No? There are real structural issues, inequality, that drove them to vote for Marcos. So, but also, I would also like to disagree with Toti and most of my economist friends that the decades-long push for neoliberal policies also contributed to this politics of frustration and anger among those who did not benefit from market reform. So if we're going to push for more market reforms and incentives, we also have to tame the inequality-inducing side effects of market reforms.
I think there's a balancing, that needs to happen, wherein your neoliberal policies can become more effective if you have political reforms that create a democratic space. I think that's maybe it's our next challenge. Okay, I've been given the signal that unfortunately we're running out of time. I do have 3 more questions here, and I don't know, what I'll do is I'll throw out these questions very quickly, and then it will be your last word, for each of our speakers. If you still want to chime in, if you still want. So there's a question whether, first, will these commitments in the SONA, are they achievable in 6 years? Next, what would you consider as the single biggest omission of the SONA, something that should have been there? Just one item. And last, PBBM said that the state of the nation is sound. Do you agree whether it is sound? So let's go. Let's start with Dr. Imelda Dainla.
I think I'd like to answer what is the biggest omission. I think one of the biggest omission is really the absence of remark on human rights, and that it's really very fundamental, to our state of democracy and rule of law, and that really in a way shows the lack of interest perhaps, or the lack of concern, for especially for individual rights, and I think that also has implications in terms of inclusivity and participation. Because if you don't really give importance to human rights, then how is it possible for a broad range of Filipinos to actually participate in a meaningful way, to be empowered, no, to be able to function, as to fulfill their civic duty as a Filipino, and also to contribute to strengthening democracy and the rule of law.
Okay, so an eerie silence on
Yes.
human rights there. Zaiza?
Yeah, I'd like to answer the same question, what was not mentioned during the SONA. And I do agree with Dr. Dela. It's also the absence of any strong commitment on good governance and anti-corruption. While it was very heavily, while the fiscal policy was heavily discussed, like I said earlier during my presentation, fiscal policy will only benefit society if it's contingent on addressing democratic deficits. And I think as part of civil society, we need to be able to reclaim that space and participate in democratic governance, so that fiscal policy will benefit not just the elites, not just politicians, but really the various sectors of society who are supposed to benefit from having a medium-term fiscal framework in the first place. So I think throughout the administration of President Marcos, we need to watch out and be critical always of whose interest will prevail when the medium-term fiscal framework is being implemented, because it's not gonna automatically translate to a more equitable and just society just because we reach a certain level of revenue collection, just because the government is able to disburse a certain level of spending.
So do you think the state of the nation is sound?
Oh, definitely not.
Okay. Kiko?
As I mentioned in my presentation, what's missing is really the addressing corruption. And Professor Dindo Manhit already mentioned that it's still an urgent national concern among Filipinos. It's the fifth after the economic issues. So the president mentioned that the government will invest a lot in infrastructure, social services, health provision. So that requires also rationalizing the tax system. So if you want to collect more from taxpayers, then the citizens as taxpayers should also be assured that there would be no leakage. And there have been leakages as estimated even by the ombudsman. And he did not even talk about the need to strengthen the ombudsman, given that one of the first acts of the president was not to have his own anti-graft committee or commission that's usually put in place by a new president. And I support him for that. It means that he would like to follow the institutions, which means strengthening the ombudsman, the Commission on Audit, the Civil Service Commission, and respecting legislative oversight and civil society participation. Although these things I added. So there's really a need to frame the discussion. And I think that will add to the political stock of the president if he is true to his promise of unity, because there were a lot of people who did not support him. And the reason for not supporting is their fear of that corruption will return. And of course, it has not left the Philippines, but the big corruption of the past. So yeah, I think that's the critical issue.
Thank you, Kiko. July?
Yeah, as mentioned by my colleagues, it's the lack of commitment to democratic norms, at least in the SONA, no? And as mentioned already by Imelda, we need to address democratic regression, no? And if he ran in the election like the democratic Marcos of 1965, no, trying to redeem himself from the authoritarian Marcos of 1980, 86, right? So it would be a great legacy, and in fact, another irony in the second Marcos presidency, if the president who ends up strengthening democratic institutions in the country would be another Marcos. So, well, hope springs eternal.
Yeah. Well, let's actually hope that happens. And last but not the least, Toti.
Well, I will like to echo the observation of my colleague, Dr. Roel Briones. What was missing in SONA is actually a good thing. What was missing was references to 20 peso, rice, reviewing the rice tarification law and other protectionist measures, and populist measures. I didn't see any populism unlike the one of President Duterte, So that to me, the absence of references to that was actually a very good thing, that he didn't revert to that usual populism. As far as the state is concerned, it's I would say it's a sound in the sense that we just had elections in which there was a peaceful transition of power, in which the majority expressed their opinion through the votes. So in that sense, I think we are on a firmer footing as far as democracy is concerned.
Thank you. And thank you, Toti, and thank you to all our panelists, our speakers, and for bearing with us, and sharing your insights and your time. And now we close the open forum and go to our closing. We're now going to invite our closing speaker, who is now a trustee of the Strat-based ADR Institute. I met our last speaker when I was very young, impressionable law student, doing Jesup moot court. So we actually met in Washington, D.C., where he was doing the SJD in Harvard University. Dr. Raul Pangalangan. He's a former judge of the International Criminal Court in The Hague at the Netherlands, and also former dean of the University of the Philippines College of Law and former fellow of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So he is here to take in all of these insights and to give us his own insights and properly end this town hall meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Raul Pangalangan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony, for the kind and very personal introduction. Yes, I do recall that morning when I saw you, when you represented the Philippines in the Philip Jesup Moot Court competition in Washington, D.C. First of all, I want to thank our convener, Professor Dean Domanit, for bringing together this stellar cast of speakers. Toti referred to the SONA as a very technocratic SONA, and it is the strength of Strat-based that it is able to gather a powerhouse panel of speakers to address that technical SONA and make it understandable and relevant to the audience, considering that it requires both a grasp of technical matters of economics, but likewise strategic and tactical elements of politics. And for that, I congratulate and thank Dindo. In a sense, our forum today actually performs the function of what Dr. Kiko Magno referred to as information intermediaries. And I think this is indeed a vacuum that has been filled by the Strat-based forums. So Dindo, for instance, Professor Manhit began with a discussion of the latest surveys, some of them confidential until this morning, and explained their relevance to our audience today. For me, the central point that I'd like to focus on is the effect of the fact that Marcos Jr. became president on the back of an overwhelming political mandate. And I think it presents both strengths and weaknesses for him. For instance, Toti mentioned that this is a SONA which was bereft of the usual populist rhetoric. Well, I think that's one advantage of the fact that this is a president which won by an overwhelming mandate. He did not have to resort to that populist mandate. One of our speakers, Zaiza Nadine Suzara, referred to him as a continuity president. I think to that extent, it is a burden that he has to live with. The extent to which he relies upon the Duterte legacy and the Duterte appeal, and the burden of having to present himself as an heir to that legacy. But on the other hand, he also has to distinguish himself from that legacy. So, for instance, Toti proposes that to end the Duterte reform of free college tuition. I can see the point of Toti and to resort instead to scholarships for the poor. But I imagine it will take a president with an overwhelming mandate like Marcos Jr. to take on a very populist policy by the former president. I can imagine it is an easy sell for Marcos Jr. to follow Toti's prescription on debt condonation and reforming land retention limits. But there are also some proposals which will require this president to prepare himself for resistance from the usual groups. For instance, the proposal to lift the Filipino first constraints in the Constitution. I suppose I will not be surprised if the usual so-called nationalist groups will oppose that. As regards Professor Tihanki's proposals on how to curtail elite domination of our politics, I do share his concerns. I am certainly optimistic that his proposal, the three phases and his strategy for three phases and for the gradual taking of measures to address these problems, I do hope they work. And I would like to close then with the discussion of constitutional reform. As has been noted by several of our speakers, it has been attempted both under President Fidel Ramos and under President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And we have posed opposition to that in many ways, all the way to the Supreme Court of the Republic. But many of the reforms which are being proposed will require constitutional change. And I can only speculate the extent to which a president like Marcos Jr., enjoying his mandate, will put that mandate to a test and propose constitutional changes. In other words, the extent to which he will put his capital, he will risk his political capital for this measure, especially since it was his father who actually tampered with the Constitution and used it as a mechanism for him to ease the seizure of and consolidation of power following the declaration of martial law in 1972. I share the concern of our speakers that once again, we might see a constitutional change attempt as a mechanism to lift term limits or otherwise pave the way for the continuation of the incumbent in power. On that point, I once again congratulate StratBase for getting together this wonderful group of speakers, and I look forward to the next panel to be organized by StratBase. Thank you very much. Back to Tony.
Thank you so much, Raul. And before we say our goodbyes to everyone, we come to a most important part of the town hall meeting, which is our photo op. It's for the panelists. No? So I'd like to ask all our panelists to turn on their videos. No? And will someone?
Yes, pa.
Ay, ikaw na.
I'm on standby.
Sige. So smile.
1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Again, thank you. Thank you to Dindo and the StratBase ADR team for having me. And thank you for everyone who participated and who attended this town hall meeting. Till the next one, this has been Tony Abad, and have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.